If you enjoy unusual stories, you've come to the right place.
This story is based on real events. The story of the Shea family. When Ben and Jamie Shea loaded the last box into the truck, the Arkansas sky was a pale wash of autumn. The house they'd bought sat at the end of a country lane, a tired two-story set back under oak trees, with a sagging porch and a history written in layers of paint and old letters. For Ben, a night shift nurse, the move was supposed to mean cheaper mortgage payments and room for their growing family. Jamie, their 11-year-old daughter, a 5-year-old son, and an infant who fit into a sling and slept like a stone. They told themselves the house had character. The realtor had called it full of possibilities, which meant they could remodel. The price, low even for Arkansas, meant they could afford to breathe. Those first hours were full of hope, laughter, the clink of dishes, the soft hum of a radio tuned to an easy station. The house listened. It waited. At night, as boxes became furniture, the house settled. So when they first heard the soft footfall on the attic stairs, a single step, then silence, they wrote it off as old woodworking, the kind of affectionate rationalization people used to keep their world orderly. But still, a cold draft where no window was open, a smell of something sharp and metallic that floated from one room and vanished. They set up the crib. They turned down the lamp. They slept, two exhausted parents who trusted the bones of a house to shelter their small ones. Part 2, the little signs. Small things came first, easy explainable things, and that's why they were so reliable as harbingers. The baby monitor would crackle with static at 2:13 a.m., and once there was the unmistakable sound of a child crying from the monitor when every bedroom was empty. A battery-operated toy truck sat on the nursery rug and one afternoon began to move of its own accord, lights flashing, the tiny engine whining, rolling forward in a path that no hand had set. Jamie found a pentagram, roughly drawn, behind a loose panel in the pantry. She scrapped at it with her fingernail, half laughing with disbelief, half chilled. The marking looked fresh, as if someone had used charcoal to make it in a hurry. Ben, practical and stubborn, photographed it, sealed the pantry, and suggested they might have inherited a prank from teenagers. Except this house was at the end of a long lane, and no teens lived nearby. Nobody else seemed to have keys. By day the home was a house. By night it shifted, revealing edges they hadn't known it had. The children began to speak of friends who didn't seem to be visible, a boy who sat by the window and watched them, a voice that sang lullabies into the corners. When Ben came home from the hospital, tired and stoic, their eldest spoke up without prompting. "Daddy," the boy says, "thanks for the cookies." Ben smiled and said, "Who gave the cookies?" The child tilted his head and answered plainly, "He did, the little boy." Ben did not laugh then. Part 3, the children's world. Children create their own reality out of rules of play, fantasy, and sharp imaginations. In the Shea house, their imaginations seemed to brush up against something else that did not need pretend. The 5-year-old would talk in the attic doorway, recounting a game he'd had with Tommy, though no Tommy ever arrived for tea. Jamie brushed crumbs from his sleeves and told him not to use real names for invisible friends. But the toddler described details a child should not know. The sound of a train that had not run in those parts for decades, a nickname that matched a faded photograph found in a boarded-up bedroom. The 11-year-old, mature for her age, began to have nightmares. A dark figure at the foot of her bed, a small hand that reached past the duvet to touch her hair. One evening, alone in the kitchen, the daughter drew a face on a paper towel and labeled it Seth as a joke. She did not know then how the name would find its way into the story again and again. What terrified the parents was not that the children had imaginary friends, of course they did, but the persuasive insistence that these presences knew things. The younger boy answered questions about the house before the parents had asked them. He cried when Jamie packed his ribbon blanket in a box. "He's sad," he said, as if reciting an eyewitness account. Part 4, first escalation. At first it was a whisper, things misplaced, lights that flicked in time with heartbeats. Then the house started to yell. Doors slammed with no wind to blame. A sudden weight pressed on Ben's chest one night when he staggered down the hall. He thought he'd slipped, but his shoes still sat by the doorway. The nursery window, latched tight at dusk, was later found open, and the curtains fluttered as if someone had hurried out into the dark and then come back in. The baby monitor caught a voice that said unmistakably, "Get out." Skepticism bent the parents at first. They documented everything. Ben's need for proof meant a camera here, a notebook there. But cameras do not always capture what people feel in the room. The nausea that arrives like low tide, the sense that the air has weight. The youngest child began awake screaming, hands clenched, as if reaching for an unseen hand. One night Jamie found the crib mattress torn in a way that suggested frantic scraping. Neighbors, when pressed, admitted that the lane held stories, the house had stood there longer than most, and the land had a history that mixed farming omens with whispered tragedies. But when Jamie asked the oldest neighbor about specific incidents she'd heard on the old recorder in the library, the neighbor's mouth flattened. "Some things," she said, "you don't want to dig them up." Part 5, the research. Jamie's need for answers turned into obsession. Days became research, hours poring over yellowed newspapers, records at the county office, the muffled hum of printers in the library after closing. The house, she felt, was a puzzle, and she needed the picture to make any sense of the pieces. Local records showed prior residents, some names scratched out by age or covered with coffee rings. There was a death, not a spectacular one, but a child's illness noted in a ledger from the 1930s. There were rumors in the margins, a small grave behind the barn long since moved, an argument in the house that set tongues wagging about a cult meeting decades before, but nothing gave a clean, verifiable line to the present. Markham appeared in their paperwork, but there was suspicion that the name was used in documentation as a placeholder or a shorthand. In the stacks, the librarian, a gray-haired woman with a steady voice, told Jamie she had seen similar patterns in other houses. People stay until grief becomes a tenant, she said, and didn't mean the living. Jamie became convinced something historic had nested in the rafters, a child's grief refusing to leave and something else that fed off it. At nights they would cross-check, footnote to footnote, call to county historian. Jamie took a photograph of the pentagram and filed it away. In one ledger she found the faint pencil scrawl of a name that matched the nickname the daughter had given that paper napkin drawing. The house was revealing its lineage, but not in a way that comforted. Part 6. The Nursery Incident. It was a small, ordinary night, the baby asleep, the others tucked into their rooms, Ben packing a lunch in the kitchen. Jamie sat at the dining table and counted bills when the monitor vibrated with sound, a rapid, breathless cry that was not the baby's normal, unsettled whimper. She ran in, adrenaline and instinct quick as light. The crib rails were down, blankets lay in a heap. For a moment she stared, the room smelling of candle wax and copper. Then she noticed marks on the wood, shallow gouges, as if little hands had scraped the slats. On the wall near the baseboard was a small handprint of soot or ash. Jamie snapped a photo with a trembling hand and called Ben. He came home in 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. When he saw the camera's timestamp, he felt dizzy. Nobody could have broken in that span. Doors and windows were locked, and the neighborhood was silent. They found the baby monitor later that night replaying a lullaby in a voice that was not Jamie's, not Ben's. The tape hissed and a whisper threaded through, "Not yours." After that night, there was no longer any pretense of ordinary. The house had defined its foothold in the family's life. It had made a demand they could not refuse. Part 7. The Nanny's Story. They hired help for 2 reasons, necessity and the hope that a fresh set of eyes could either rationalize or confirm their fears. The nanny, a woman named Carla with an easy smile, took to the kids and the old boards like someone returning to a familiar song. She stayed 3 days. On the second night she called Jamie at 3 a.m. Her voice was thin, a thread pulled too tight. She described a small boy in the hallway watching from the top of the stairs who traced his finger along the banister and then vanished. He giggled, she said, and paused. Then he screamed like a man, like a grown man. I had to get out. Carla left the next morning and did not return. Her statement was the first outside corroboration. People from the town who spoke to the Sheas later used the same word. They felt observed, as if someone stood where the light did not reach and watched them with patient eyes. Part 8. The Name Appears. After Carla left, occurrences escalated. Once late at night, the eldest saw writing appear on the fogged-up bathroom mirror, letters forming as if pressed by a warm finger. The daughter cleaned the mirror and laughed it off, but the next morning found the word again. 4 letters, deeply carved in condensation and later in the paint beneath. The word read, Seth. For the family, the name landed like a plank across their reason. Where did a simple human name gain such traction? Jamie remembered the napkin drawing. Ben remembered the way the voice on the monitor had once modeled a lullaby with an oddly archaic cadence. The name Seth, ordinary in speech, proved to be an anchor. Whenever anyone said the name aloud, the air in the room seemed to flat, like the surface of a lake being swatted by a hand. The children called the little boy Seth now, and when Jamie asked the 5-year-old who had taught him the name, he shrugged. He told me, the child said. Part 9. The Ouija and the Break. Desperation will prompt more extreme choices. The Sheas, exhausted and sleepless, turned to avenues they had scoffed at earlier. When Ben's cousin brought over an old Ouija board as a curiosity, more a relic of teenage mischief than a tool of communication, the family gathered around with candles, intending to treat it like a seance from a cheap movie. Humor was part of their armor. The pointer moved the first time. They all blamed it on the youngest, on tiny fingers on the planchette. But the majority of hands were elsewhere. Their motions were too slow to account for the sudden, jerking movements. The planchette spelled a name, Seth, then the letters shifted and spelled a partial phrase, G-O, and stopped as if the board itself had been startled. After that session, things became louder. Shadows gained edges. Ben reported waking to the sense of standing in the dark and being watched, then slammed awake with an armful of bruises he could not explain. The eldest found her hair pulled as she slept. Scratches appeared along the younger boy's arms as if something had dragged nails across skin while he dreamed. Friends who visited left early. One, a pastor from a nearby town, whispered that some presences do not respond to prayer alone. Part 10, calling for help. Ben and Jamie felt cornered. They had called police for a welfare check once, but law enforcement left the scene with empathy and shrugged shoulders. There was no obvious criminality, no intruder. That left them to seek help from people who specialized in the kind of problems modern law would not note: paranormal investigators. The team that arrived was small, a married pair and their adult daughter who worked with cameras and EVP recorders. They smelled of sage and stale coffee, their van stacked with equipment. They took the family's story with a mixture of professional distance and worried eyes. Experienced investigators learned to listen for the patterns that indicate something older than a prank. The investigators set up cameras and audio devices in the bedrooms, the nursery, the attic. They called in psychics and they mapped the house, drawing lines and circles and pointing out places where electromagnetic readings spiked without explanation. One investigator, a woman who kept a rosary tucked into her jean pocket despite her skepticism, described an oppressive pressure over the nursery, a cold she compared to a pocket of night air. On the third night of investigation, the monitors picked up a sound that made the hair rise on every neck in the room. A slow, guttural voice that did not belong to any member of the family, the voice humming a mangled lullaby and then intoning a name in a cadence like a vow. Seth. Part 11, the confrontation. The team tried everything in their arsenal: thermal imaging, spirit boxes that sweep radio fragments into interrupted phrases, and ritualized cleansings that combined prayer and practical measures: salt lines, open windows, small crosses placed in doorways. Nothing produced a single, easy answer. Some things abated for hours, then came back with a quickness that suggested intent. The investigators reported seeing footage of a dark, child-shaped figure at the top of the stairs, hands pressed to its face as if sobbing. EVPs, electronic voice phenomenon, captured whispers that, when slowed and cleaned, seemed to say, "You can't have them," and later, "Leave." Once, a camera recorded toys being flung across a room with enough force to dent plaster. The daughter described the figure as sometimes small and frightened, sometimes large and furious, as if two spirits occupied the same body, a lost child and something older that wore and used that child like a skin. The theory rippled through the team: a parasitic intelligence that fed on sorrow and fear, a demonic presence that could mimic childhood innocence to gain proximity to tender things. For the family, there came a moment when anger replaced fear. Ben refused to be pushed from his home by an unseen tenant. They planned an exorcism-like cleansing, not an official rite but an intervention structured by desperate will and the rituals that feel meaningful when science falters. Part 12, the cleansing. They prepared, candles were lit. Doors were open to let the cold night air in and to invite light to chase out shadow. The investigators chanted, prayed, and called the names of saints. A priest was contacted and declined at first. The matter, in his words later, required more information, but a woman in the team performed a prayer that combined scripture with old country rites, a hybrid of faith stitched under pressure. As they moved through the house, the atmosphere changed like weather shifting before a storm. A sound like a bowl of wind filled the hallways, the candles guttered. Then a shriek so raw that even the skeptics put hands to their ears. The cameras caught movement, a blur building at the stairwell, a shadow coalescing and then striking out like an animal. When the yelling stopped, the house fell into a silence so complete it'd wait. The investigators, exhausted and shaken, claimed a measure of success. The temperature rose, the monitors cleared, and a tangible lift seemed to occur. For the first time in weeks, the children slept without waking. The family exhaled. They thought the ordeal was over. Part 13, the return and the leaving. Relief was fragile. For a handful of weeks, the house felt lighter. Toys did not move by themselves. The lullaby did not play in the night. The family tried to live normally, but the reprieve was a thin membrane over a deeper reality. On a rainy night, when the wind pressed against the windows like a warning, the eldest child woke and said, "He came back, he's angry." The pentagram reappeared, drawn in a new place in the house, in the attic, inked into an old floorboard. The youngest pulled at Jamie's sleeve and, with solemnity a child should not have, said, "Seth says it's not finished." Ben and Jamie decided to leave. They packed like people fleeing until dawn, carrying photo albums in their small, stubborn hope that distance might be protection. The house, as if offended, shook doors with a final, furious slam as they left. They did not sell it, they left it empty. A spot in the lane where the grass grew a little higher and a porch swing settled into a slow, unprompted sway. Part 14, new occupants, same whispers. Time moved the house through other lives. Neighbors reported that people moved in and then out, sometimes within months. New owners wrote it off, creaky planks, old pipes, stories for campfires. But a pattern emerged. Visitors reported hearing a boy's laughter at odd hours, the feeling of being watched in the attic, toys turned neatly from time to time. Some tenants reported nothing darker than a sense of melancholy. Others, a voice that called a child's name in the night. One family who later lived there swore they saw a little boy at the window, fingers pressed to the glass as if begging to be let in. On one occasion, a couple painted over the attic floorboard where the pentagram had been carved, and the paint bubbled and peeled in the shape of a small handprint. Rumor spreads its own truth. The house entered local lore as the one with the little boy. Townspeople told the story in hushed tones at the diner, adding color to the edges. A suicide near the well, a child lost in the woods, an old family feud. None of these details matched cleanly with public records, but stories in small towns need not be precise to find belief. Part 15, Epilogue: What to Believe. The Shea family's story lives in two places: in the heavier, darker reel of the television episode that dramatized their terror, and in the quieter, more uncertain place of local memory and records. When you strip away the cinematic edits, the string of CCTV clips, and the retelling that grows teeth with each passerby, what remains is an account of a family who felt hunted in their own home. Was it a malevolent spirit named Seth, a tragic child's lingering sorrow, a manipulative intelligence that used the image of a boy to tempt and torment? Or was it a sequence of stress-fueled misperceptions, ordinary misfortunes arranged by memory into a pattern that had to mean something? There are plausible psychological and environmental explanations. Carbon monoxide and mold can create symptoms of disorientation and hallucination. Stress and sleep deprivation magnify small events into threats. Yet many who examine the Shea house insist the phenomena exceeded explainable bounds: EVPs, thermal anomalies, objects moving with force. The most honest answer is a story of limits. People interpreted what they saw and what they felt through the filter of belief, fear, and protective instinct. The house became an axis where grief, memory, and the unknown converged. The investigators left with footage and testimonies that still make listeners' skin prickle. The family left with their lives in tatters but intact, relieved to be away from the place that had once been a home. If you ever find yourself traveling a back road in Arkansas and you see a lonely house at the end of a lane, remember the Sheas. Remember that a house is more than timber and insulation. It is a container of stories, of lives lived and losses kept. And sometimes, if you press your ear to the thin slat of the porch, you might hear a lullaby sung softly in a voice that is not quite human and a childish whisper that ends with one name: Seth.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.